Can I also firstly ask for everyone to put their phones off or on silent so we don't have any embarrassing calls and people having to shout the bar afterwards? So I'll introduce myself first. So Chris Norman, I'm the CEO of NRM Regions Queensland. So I have the privilege of working with the 12 regional NRM organisations across the state in delivering all the amazing work that they do. And I'd like to welcome everybody here this evening. I am actually a southerner, so I come from Brisbane. But probably worse than that, I come from Victoria. So I've had 4 years here. So I have moved a bit north. Have people heard of Victoria? A couple. Also, a special welcome to those online. So we understand there's quite a few people online tonight as well. So welcome to everybody that's online. And my good IT man tells me I'm not allowed to step a metre to the left, because if I do, I go off the screen. So, so far, thumbs up. So yeah, we're welcoming you here on behalf of CAFNEC, Terrain NRM, Cape York NRM and Gold Savannah NRM, who've pulled this evening together. A special apology from Barry Hunter. So Barry is the chair of Terrain NRM, who's unwell tonight and unable to make it. But I'd like to now pass over to Gavin and Irriganji Man and Dennis from Jabbergai to do an official welcome to country. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Good evening. I'd just like to introduce myself. My name is Dennis Hunter, Barry's cousin. We got this last call the last minute to do a welcome because he couldn't make it, and I was going, oh, yeah, okay. But now I'm here. I come from the Jabbergai people, one of the Jabbergai Nation speaking people, along with my little brother here, DJ. He's part of the Irriganji family. So I speak for all the groups and representing each of the clan group, which is Irrigai, Bulwai, Ngajali, Wurundjeri, and Jabberganji. We're all 5 groups of that sort of overarching. And my position is cultural development officer. So I do a lot of cultural engagements with the community. And there's a few projects that's going to be happening alongside. I see one member over there sitting down, Kathy. Look, we come from this beautiful country here, and it's lovely being part of the wet tropics, and acknowledging our southern neighbours with the Yidden mob, Yiddenji, Gugayalanji is our northern neighbours, and just up from Port Douglas there, a little bit out west is Gugu Mulurigi, our western neighbours, and around is our Yorubal and Ngajinji and Mamu family groups down south there. But you made it to this beautiful side of this country here. Just like to welcome you to this evening, and hope everything goes well and zooming in. And I'll hand over to Brother DJ. And thank you. And once again, thank you, Barry, for this opportunity. But have a good evening. Thank you.
Yeah, jeri nyeramba garang andumba nyermomoko kama nyeneng bulmba nyermomoko gaban biridina nyermbulmba gogoi. So also I would like to firstly wish everyone here in good spirits and safe travels here and when you return home after the event. I too want to extend that respect and acknowledgement to all of our families that sort of make up our Jabbergai Ngirima language nation, but also our neighbours and neighbouring family groups, Yidinji people, Gungenji people of Yarrabah, to the north Gugiyalanji, and also to the west of us we have Mulurigi people of Mariba. Here in the this area here of Smithfield is very, very special to our people, and we know that the Cairns region anyway is sort of on that border between the wet tropics, rainforest, and the Great Barrier Reef World Heritage Areas, which is a part of our identity, who we are. It's also part of our law and custom, our tradition, our language really underpins everything, and it's great today that we're able to share our connection, our knowledge with all the partners that we work with. I currently manage the Yurikanja Land and Sea Ranger program, and we work hand in hand with Jabagai Bulmba Rangers as well. And we're all, playing our part on looking after country, fulfilling our cultural responsibilities. But, we cannot do it alone. We have to work with our partners, different government agencies as well. Doesn't matter who's in power. Our responsibilities back to our country, back with our people and community, and just working with everyone that are here. And it's great that we're able to have this conversation around how we best manage our protected areas, our environment, our landscape around us, and just reminding that traditional owners who are still here, we're doing a lot of positive work as well, but a lot of our positive work as well is also done when we're working in partners with others. Example here at James Cook University, we've got a Crankworks event here where our people were part of a lot of the cultural heritage clearances, but also, we're exploring ways how we can enhance that experience with our culture in terms of the interpretive side, but also training and employment opportunities that are there. There's places here that are cultural significance, places like Double Island, Taylor Point, other areas as well that are really special to our people. And all we want is, especially our elders, want to be part of the management, want to be part of maintaining our connection and responsibilities to those places, but creating a positive future for everyone, even for our younger people, putting them on track. Our next emerging leaders, because they're going to take over, inherit those responsibilities set by our elders and set by us. And we cannot do it without working together. But anyway, wish everyone in good spirits. Look forward to this discussion tonight. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. It's fantastic. And Dennis, I'm here because Uncle Barry asked me as well. So thank you. And I guess from my perspective and everybody here, acknowledge the contribution of First Nations people to managing our natural resources here for 65,000 plus years. So tonight is about an opportunity to listen to some of the key issues and themes for this region, and give our LNP members a chance to talk about what they see as the future for this region and an opportunity to respond to some of those challenges. So I'd like to introduce Sam O'Connor. So Sam is the Shadow Minister for Environment and for Great Barrier Reef. And so Sam, if you want to come up and say a few words. As Sam's making his way up, don't get too excited about asking Sam questions yet. He's going to be on the panel, so you get lots of chances to ask him lots of questions in a minute, but if you'd like just to do a welcome from your perspective, Sam.
Thank you, Chris. I think I'm on every single panel, so you can ask me every single question that you have on your mind. Can I just acknowledge our traditional custodians as well and thank them for that welcome, and to acknowledge the practical work that they do to care for their country. They're right in saying that no matter who is in government, that they are supported, because it's one of the most strongly bipartisan things, our Indigenous Rangers program, and it's something that both sides very much support, no matter who the government of Queensland is or who the federal government is. So it's an excellent program, and we had a great showcase of their work at Parliament a couple of weeks ago. Can I thank CAFNEC and Terrain and NRMs more broadly, with yourself, Chris, for joining with us tonight and for putting this on, and to thank you for all the work that you do to care for your beautiful country up here, and to promote and protect what is the best portfolio, I think, in government. It's a role that I've had for nearly 4 years now, and it's a very there's a lot that environment touches over, pretty much everything. It's something I'm very personally passionate about. So in my brief remarks before we get on to actual experts, and actually I should acknowledge my two hopefully future colleagues here as well. Bree James, give a wave. Bree's running for Barron River, and David Kempton is running for Cook. They're running to represent this region at the election in October. And this is an opportunity for you as well as all the key stakeholders in this region, in this space, to talk to them and to make sure that all your good ideas get into their heads as well, because these are two very important seats, and an election coming up is a very good way to get things on the agenda. But the two areas that I'll touch on at the start of my contribution before we talk to actual experts are the highest priorities I see in the environment portfolio. And the number one is conservation. We need to increase our protected estate in Queensland. Our estate is 8.61%. It's the figure we found out in the budget last week. It's sitting at 8.61% of our state is protected in either a national park or special wildlife reserve or nature refuge. That is far too low. It's increased from 7.8% a decade ago. And from my perspective, I think we need to have a different approach to complement the current approach of focusing on more and bigger national parks. And that approach for me is finding a new way to incentivize private land conservation. So I see this as the fastest and most genuine way to increase our estate to somewhere towards the level that it should be. We need to find a way to make conservation an opportunity, not an impost for landholders. There's models around the country that are doing a lot better than us at the moment. The private protected area estate is 4.7 million hectares across 574 properties, and those landholders get just $2.4 million to manage that land from the state government. So if you're joining that estate, you're basically only doing that out of the kindness of your own heart. So if we can find a way to genuinely incentivize that by both removing barriers, whether that's making sure that you don't have to pay land tax on conservation estates, and we're the only state that still charges land tax on people who join the protected estate. It could be by the way of a subsidy to local councils for rates, or the bigger picture is about finding a way to get stewardship payments that can properly incentivize people to join the private protected area estate. And I see NRMs as playing a very important role in helping to get landholders on board. You're trusted by landholders. You do exceptional work on the ground. And I think you can play a really, really big role in helping to increase the estate in that way, as well as organisations like Queensland Trust for Nature. So increasing the estate, but also better managing the estate that we have. There was some funding that I very much welcome in the budget last week for a more specialised fire response team within the Parks and Wildlife Service. That is sorely needed. But we need to make sure that we're filling all the range of positions that are available, and in fact hiring more rangers and supporting them properly to manage our public estate. That really is overdue. It's something that we need to prioritise as a government, because these are our most special parts of our environment, and they need to be more genuinely managed by the state government. And the other priority in the portfolio is, of course, the biggest challenge that our economy will face for the foreseeable future, and that's decarbonisation. So in Queensland, we have bipartisanship on the trajectory of climate action, and that is there's no debate around net zero and the targets along the way. Those laws were passed with the support of both major parties in April this year. And those targets are, of course, a 75% reduction in our emissions by 2035 and the ultimate goal of net zero by 2050. So whoever the next government of Queensland is, the first step in that pathway will be the establishment of the Clean Economy Expert Panel. It's not a great acronym. I thought they could have worked on that a little bit better, but it doesn't really work. It needs something a little catchier. I'm open to new names on that if you've got something. But that body will be the coordinating authority for the sector plans. So that is where each major part of our economy will lay out their decarbonisation trajectory. And if I have the privilege of being Environment Minister, my role as the Minister responsible for climate action would be to help coordinate those, to make sure that we're defining our roles properly as government and supporting industry as they put those plans together. And they're the big picture ones. So you've got tourism would be one, I'd imagine. You'd have agriculture, you'd have our energy system, which is obviously the overwhelming bulk of our emissions, but that's predominantly a government responsibility. You would have the waste system. It's defining those key parts of our economies and figuring out what action is being taken by the people who are the experts and who living and breathing that every day, and defining what role government should have to support that, and what broader role government should play with that as well. There are so many more things to talk about in the environment portfolio, but I think I will leave it there. And I just want to again say thank you for being here. I'm very much looking forward to this discussion, and I'll be here as late as you want if you've got questions for me. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Sam, and thanks for the passion that you show for the portfolio. And as you're rightly say, it's the most important portfolio of any minister in government, although we are a little bit biased, aren't we? So the purpose of this evening, as I said, to discuss and articulate some of the policies that affect the waterways, pest, weeds and animals, the restoration of threatened species and the climate adaptation processes across this region. How we're going to do it is to have 3 panels. So there'll be 3 panels. So the first panel will join us in a second. There'll be some opening words from one of the speakers. They'll introduce the panel members, and then they'll present 5 minutes on that topic, and then we'll open it up for Q&As from the floor. So when we do that, there will be somebody running around with a mic. So can I just get people to be a little bit patient till the mic arrives to them, and then if they can just say their name and direct their question. Tonight is not the time for statements. We don't have much time. So what happens typically in these things is there's long statements made. Tonight's not about statements, it's about questions. We've got a really good 3 sets of panels, so please articulate those questions clearly to the panel members. And please respect different views. It's the value of being in a country like Australia, is that we can express different views. So there will be lots of different views, I'm sure, here tonight, and that's something we actually should embrace. So thank you for that in lieu of what's going to happen next. So I'm going to introduce Ro Hill from JCU, and her panel with Mark and Pip and Kathy, if they want to come up at the same time and sit up here at the front. I'll pass over to Ro, who's going to talk about protected areas and management. We're going to have a discussion around the need to increase protected areas to meet global targets and the need to manage them better, as well as with joint and Indigenous lead management. So your hands, Ro.
Thanks very much, Chris. And I'd just like to thank Gavin and Dennis for that lovely welcome to country and acknowledge the traditional owners whose land we're standing on and their elders, past and present, and as Gavin pointed out, the emerging futures leaders, which are so important to us all. I'm just going to briefly introduce the panel members. Mark Olsen, who is the CEO of Tourism Tropical North Queensland, really important, vital industry in our area. Pip Schur, who works with Cape York NRM, obviously critical to the future of any protected area is NRM management. And then Kathy Ritter, who is with Kuranda EnviroCare. So that's a great panel. I'm just going to share a few quick slides with you. I don't actually know how to move them forward. What do I need to know? You can do it? Okay. So next slide. Yes. So we're just talking about the global framework for biodiversity and protected area management comes through the Convention on Biological Diversity. They had a conference of the parties last year where they set the next 10-year plan. And this is the global target about protected areas. It's actually got a few more words in it than this, that I've just picked out 3 of the main elements. You can easily see all the words on the internet. So it's an ensure and enable that by 2030, at least 30% of terrestrial inland water areas and marine and coastal areas are protected, and also effectively governed, effectively conserved, managed and equitably governed. And then the third part, recognising and respecting the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities, including over their traditional territories. So we just heard Sam say 8.6%, the target is 30%. Next slide, please. This is just a graph of Queensland's progress. I didn't have the budget papers, or I probably should have, but I didn't look at them. So at the moment, in 2023, it was 8.18%. So it's obviously grown a little bit since then to 8.61. And you can see from that it has grown very slowly. I can't read them from here, but hopefully you can see that there's a year under each of those bar graphs. Can you see that? Yep.
2000.
Yeah, so we've got a long way to go and we're not going there fast at all. And if we keep going at that rate, we are definitely not going to get there. So the next slide, if you talk about management, I think funding has really got a lot to do with management. We know we need money to pay rangers, to go out and do weed control, to catch pigs, all the things that you need to do. This is figures that I put together for 2018. It's actually pretty hard to get these figures, so I'm not going to say that I can update them. But in 2018, these were pretty good comparisons. And we can see that Queensland is quite low at around $16 a hectare. The highest, I think, is New South Wales at around $50-something a hectare. And then you can look internationally that we are well behind the 8 ball in Australia if you look at USA. The two really low figures over to the left of the diagram are actually Indigenous protected areas, which are incredibly underfunded compared to the government-run protected area estate. I also noted there that Queensland is using this values-based management approach, and according to them, fewer than a quarter of their protected areas have actually got a management plan according to their value-based management. So I don't think we can really say they're effectively managed. Next slide, please. I also just want to spend a couple of minutes talking about Indigenous governance. I think Sam's given a really good introduction to this. The IUCN, which is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, is the leading authority really in protected areas globally. They're a unique organisation that has both government and non-government members and also has Indigenous members. And so to get a resolution passed, you have to have support from all three of those bodies. So it does tend to produce policies that are quite robust. And a few years ago now, about 2000, they recognised that protected areas can be governed by government. They can be governed through shared governance arrangements, typically with traditional owners, such as we have at Kakadu and Uluru. They can also be privately governed, and they can also be governed by Indigenous peoples and local communities. So I put some figures there. Australia actually put a big effort into Indigenous protected areas. These were started under coalition government in 1996. The first one was in South Australia. And we now have more than half of our 23%, which is what the representation of protected areas Australia-wide is. More than half of that comes from Indigenous protected areas, which are made by a voluntary agreement between the traditional custodians or owners of that land and the Australian government. And you can see the government-run ones are about 8%. There's obviously, I can't really see the figures from here, but there's not much in the private and shared governance. You're looking at less than 2%. When you come to Queensland, the middle passage, we're actually not doing too badly on the private governed. We got nearly 2.5%. 4.5% under government governed, but we virtually have none under the Indigenous protected area category. We've only got 0.18%, and they are actually nature refuges that have been agreed with traditional owners. So there's a really big gap there. We don't really recognise Indigenous governance of protected areas in Queensland. If you go to the next slide, you can see that Indigenous protected areas have made a huge impact in the Australian context. They really contribute hugely to our national reserve system. Everything in red is an Indigenous protected area. You can see that there are some in Queensland. They are ones that are made through agreement with the Australian government. So most of them sit over the top of existing national parks. For example, the Eastern Guuga-Yalangee have an Indigenous protected area over the Daintree National Park. There's one over the Girrigan have over the parks in the southern part of wet tropics. Over the other side of the inlet, we have the Mangalbi-Dingie Indigenous protected areas. Most people sit there looking at those beautiful mangroves and don't even realise that that's an Indigenous protected area. So we do have a little bit, but huge areas where there's nothing happening, and this is not happening under a state initiative. It's all happening under a federal initiative. So if we move to the next slide, I said, what can we do? And I just looked to the environment movement, which does a lot of policy work. In 2019, a huge alliance of NGOs have come together to put a protected area position paper. So they were calling in to invest more in acquisition, invest more in agreement making with private protected areas. I think there should also be a call for investment in agreement making with Indigenous protected areas. And they called for 56 million from con revenue into management and 50 million from the waste levy. I just also want to add that if the Queensland legislation recognised the IUCN governance diversity and particularly Indigenous protected areas, Queensland Indigenous protected areas through voluntary agreements, then that would be a great way to enhance the protected area state. And that's it for me.
Right. So we've got some mics. Thanks, Lucy. So questions. And while people are thinking about questions, there's an obvious one there, Sam, from the start with Rose's presentation, which you touched on a little bit, but we got a mic for these guys. But
sorry, I'm so fast.
that's all right. We're all over it. It likes seamless. So I guess interested in your approach, Sam, your proposed approach for LNP in terms of the way, I guess, you expand it, but also most importantly from people's perspective, how you see approaches to managing protected area state better, because the big concern is obviously they become the bad neighbour and things get particularly government land.
I'd argue they are viewed as one of the worst neighbours you can have. I hear that feedback everywhere. The IPA system, I think, has merit. It obviously has to be by agreement, and I'm just not sure if the nature of land in Queensland would suit itself to the sort of large-scale acquisition that you've seen in other states. I think it's just the nature of how Queensland's been settled and the tenure of land. That's why I see the private estate as the way to do it. It's certainly something that should be there, particularly I think for areas like the Cape. But the investment, the money that was sought, there was an investment 2 budgets ago, to give credit where it's due. There was an investment 2 budgets ago, 262.5 million that the government put in to expand the public estate. That did not come with any extra management funding, so that was the issue. Okay, I sort of gave credit and I sort of criticised. That's okay, but that was at least the sort of scale of public estate acquisition that we needed to see. Half of that will be spent in the next 2 years, so they've only spent 2 years worth of it. There's another 2 years to go. About 140 million is still left to be spent on public estate acquisition. But we didn't see the commensurate management increase. But like I mentioned at the start, that 2-point-something% of private protected areas, which is 4.7 million hectares, they only get $2.4 million in grants to manage that whole area. It's not being managed. It really is a problem. So there needs to be more support for the existing landholders who have joined that scheme. But you need to find a way to genuinely incentivize new landholders to sign up as well.
Anyone want to comment on that while I'm still waiting for hands to go up so we can start the questions from the floor? Does anyone want to comment on anything there?
I'll just make a quick comment. I wasn't proposing acquisitions for Indigenous protected areas, but I think there's the opportunity for a lot of Queensland has native title recognised over it and a lot of Indigenous land use agreements with graziers. So, maybe we were looking at new models of Indigenous protected areas through agreement making that also involves the grazier. But it's not about acquiring those lands. It's about where Indigenous people have their rights recognised, which is a lot of outback Queensland, and, coming forward with a way of running it as a protected area state.
I just want to make the comment in Cape York, there's a whole different tenure of land, which is the Cape York Aboriginal land and the Land Tenure Resolution Program. So from the Daintree North, the jointly managed national park. So they're Aboriginal freeholder underneath with national parks over the top. So it is a jointly managed with the PBC or Aboriginal Corporation or Land Trust. And so when the tenure program divvies up the land. Some is Saipale Jointly National Park. Some can be divvied up to just Aboriginal freehold, and some can be divvied up to nature refuge. So it depends on the determination of what they want. Yep.
Thanks, Pip. We have got a question from the floor. So do you want to introduce yourself, please? And then
Hi, I'm Sue Campbell. I'm a disaster resilience specialist. I've got a question about for private landowners that have small blocks and wish to protect them as nature reserve. I think we're talking before about land tax, but what other issues are there for small private landowners who are wanting to establish this kind of protection?
like that.
Kathy, I reckon you could take that question.
Speak to that too. Thanks very much, Sam. In relation to the bring up the issue of rates, that is we have attempted over the last 3 years. We've had a small amount of funding from Terrain to be able to try and get a project underway to get landholders in our area. I'm from Kuranda Envirocare, so I'm actually living in Kuranda. About $4,000, I think, to do basically habitat assessments. But basically, I agree that the protected estate can be certainly enhanced by small-ish landholders. You have to have a big area or something iconic like a threatened ecosystem or species in order to be able to get a nature refuge. But there is, at the moment, the ability to put in voluntary declarations over private landing holding, anything from a hectare upwards. Basically, people don't get any concession for rates. For putting this aside, there's no money for fencing. So there's basically, it's the goodness of your heart. But even so, we did have 12 people who put their hands up, and we managed to get protection over 10 hectares. Now, it doesn't sound a lot, but the problem was that the bigger blocks that people did want to protect, we found that they couldn't protect them because the land was remnant already, remnant status B under the Vegetation Management Act. And as such, the Department of Natural Resources says, well, that's protected already. There's a permit system, you can't clear, etc. But future owners, I mean, the current owners will know they don't want to clear, but future owners will not know that they should get a permit to clear. And the way the department handles that is that if they do clear, they give them a warning. And then if they clear again, they get a fine. So we find that the guy who owns Farmer Johnson's Markets down here in Cairns, he got fined because he did get a warning and then he did clear again. We also have evidence up here in Kuranda where there was a covenant, voluntary declaration on the blocks, and the people did know they were there because it was on title. So when you do your legals and purchasing a block, you will find out that there's a restriction. So that's great for voluntary declarations, but there's this big gap in the middle with remnant where people don't know that it is actually protected and that there is a permit system for clearing. What I see as the issue, and that was the issue for these people who had remnant forests, they were not able to do anything to protect it further under any legislation.
Nature refuge?
Nature refuges, but you have to have a big block of land or something iconic to protect, like a species or an ecosystem. So you need, maybe you need 100 hectares or 40 if you've got an iconic species, perhaps. A threatened, critically endangered species, as we do have one in Kuranda. So the problem there is there's this big gap. So we can do something for voluntary declarations, and people are very proud to have that. So they'd like to have a bit of being able to fence off, a little bit of money for planting trees, and some signage to show what they're actually doing, so that it's quite clear to everyone what's happening with this block. But people who've got remnant blocks can't produce any better protection on their land. They don't want to clear it, but they're not getting any concession from the rates, the council, for setting that land aside for wildlife. And basically, because we're going to live in a mosaic really of cleared and forested land, we need to really do something about that gap that I see.
Thanks, Kathy. Did you want to say something?
I think those properties should be able to become nature refuges or have some other kind of formal conservation agreement over them with a set payment from government to ensure that they can. You see it in New South Wales. They've got the Biodiversity Conservation Trust. The model hasn't been perfectly rolled out, but it's a good model, a good concept for how you can have an ongoing agreement with government instead of just trying to get your hands on one of these small grants or to do it out of the kindness of your own heart.
We've got another question here at the front.
Yes, hi. My name's Deborah. I run the Frog Hospital, otherwise known as Frog Safe, but I have a national parks question for you. Some years ago, I couldn't tell you exactly when, the Nature Conservation Act was amended to remove the implementation of the cardinal principle, which would allow private commercial developments inside national parks. So now we have these projects like Kalula, the Wangeti Trail up here, the Nagaro Track on Whitsunday Island, et cetera. There's more of them to come. I would like to know if your government would change the act back to what it was before to prevent private commercial developments inside national parks, as we have national parks to preserve for the future, not to exploit.
No, just to be blunt, no. The cardinal principle broadly was reinstated, I believe, by the current government in 2015. It was broadly reinstated, but it does still have a requirement or an obligation on the department to showcase what makes those properties special. And I think if you can have a development that is done to the highest possible standard, that is sustainable, I think there's great value in conservation through education. And I know that not everyone's going to be happy with that. There's a lot of people that, like potentially yourself, who think that these should just be left alone. But I really, really believe that we need more people to see our nature, to make them passionate about protecting it. And the reality is that there haven't been many ecotourism products developed in Queensland. I think there's been 3 in the last decade. It's not a revenue raiser for the department. The commercial activity permits don't bring in a lot of money. So it's not about money for the government. It's to me about having a sustainable tourism product that can showcase what makes us special to the world and make more people passionate about whatever it is in that place. But there's some areas where you would absolutely say it should not happen. But there's some areas where I think it can happen, and particularly areas that might be adjacent to national parks. I think that's got an enormous opportunity, but it would have to be to a very, very high standard, no matter where it is. I might pass to Mark for some more comments.
Yeah, I think that's a really important piece. You talked about, the last child in the world, that it's getting people back into nature. We do need to ensure that people have a connection to place. Particularly, we work closely with the Land and Sea Rangers about getting people onto country to understand what it is that is out there. But also the tourism industry is very committed to being a partner, not only in preservation, but presentation and restoration. So there's quite a lot of work that can be done. You mentioned the expansion of the National Park Estate. We wholly welcome that, but also welcome the opportunity to work with yourselves, if you were in government, around the role that tourism plays. Look at the model of the Great Barrier Reef and the role we play in presentation, in preservation and in restoration. Significant amount of funds are raised through the Environmental Management Charge. They go back into research and conservation. We've just had the World Summit on Reef Restoration here, 300 people in the room. It was all about the partnership between science and tourism in ensuring that these habitats are here for future generations. We outnumber park rangers 7-1 on the ground. So the tourism industry can be the eyes and ears of government, of the science community, just as we are with the Tourism Reef Protection Initiative, TRPI, that puts the tourism industry into a role in conservation management, monitoring and ensuring that these habitats are here for future generations. And the Great Barrier Reef, it's 5% of the Great Barrier Reef has any form of tourism on it. In the National Park Estate, it's even smaller than that again in terms of tourism access. Certainly recreation access is significantly larger than tourism access, and commercial activity permits, as you say, are not a major revenue generator. But tourism wants to play a really significant role in working with traditional owners on their storytelling, connecting people to country, and doing restoration projects. So I think, yeah.
Great, thanks, Mark. I'm going to have to wind this one up because we're running out of time, but people have got an opportunity later to come back to ask. Oh, Brian, one question because we're well over time on this panel. Go, Brian.
Okay. I was just going to say with traditional owners and ranger programs, especially for programs that are in urban areas like Cairns, one of the things that we really struggle with is you know, we're surrounded by national parks, conservation parks, and then, you know, private land. And one of the things that we see through our programs is learning about country and walking with elders and starting to realize that some of these areas are really special to us, and we want to continue to be able to have access to those parts of the country. I guess what I'm sort of trying to get to is that, you know, you can look at IPAs, you can look at buying property, but one of the things that we found is that some of the areas that are special to our people might not have the natural values, but have got the cultural values, and those cultural values really aren't. There's no weight to it. There's no thing there to say, you know, that my grandfather was born there. We've got fish traps. We've got stories to it. Oh, it's part of a dreaming site. Or it's special. We live in the middle of the World Heritage areas, both, you know, on land and on sea. And I'd really like to start to see, you know, some opportunities there where we've got rangers that are quite willing to work with a lot of other departments, but we'd like a lot of these organisations or departments or governments to start listening to us too.
Right. 1 minute, one response.
Okay. Very open to that, Brian. Government certainly do not know everything. That is the truest thing I'll say tonight. So we need to be listening, and we need to be working with people like yourselves and First Nations people like yourselves, and not thinking that we have all the solutions. Did you want to add something, 30 seconds on the tourism component?
Yeah, you know, telling stories about connection to place. You know, we are blessed to be in a country with the world's oldest continuous culture. People around the world want to make a connection to that story, and whether it's in a protected area, whether it's in an urban area, whether it's in a virtual reality form, it's the one thing that we hear. We've got an organisation that travels the world promoting this part of the world to say, see it, love it, protect it. And that includes culture, whether it's significant cultural sites like the rock art sites, right the way down to giving people of this land the opportunity to tell that story to the world, and use that to bring young people through to understand the significance of those stories, and as an economic opportunity for the future. So tourism couldn't be more committed to that partnership.
45 seconds, Mark. You've done beautifully. Thank you, panel. Thank you to Sue, Deborah and Brian for the questions, and thank you for this panel. We're going to bring on, Sam has to stay there. We're going to bring on the next panel. So Stuart, do you want to bring your panel out?
Why did I agree to this format?
Oh, you're going next, righto. So welcome to Lucy.
Welcome to.
The Lucy Sue Zoe is coming up. Sam's staying there. So this panel is going to talk about climate adaptation and disaster recovery. So what are the current nature and community impacts of climate in our region? You should know that more than anything to you guys. The key gaps and how it's exacerbating that's a good word, that, the cost of living. So in your hands, Lucy.
Thanks so much, Chris. And Sue's coming up to join us as well. And Zoe. Yeah, Zoe. Great. So I would also like to acknowledge that today we're on the lands of the Jabbergai Yurganji people and pay my respects to the First Nations people from all over Far North Queensland. For CAFNEC, we represent an area from Cardwell to the Torres Strait and west to the border, which I always like to remind people from the south that, you know, that's an area twice the size of Victoria. And a lot of people might say, well, there's not many people there, but there is a lot of really important environment, and it doesn't matter how many people, whether it's 5 or 500, those people are still important, and we still have a responsibility to look after them. So as Chris said, I'm here to talk about climate adaptation. Our region, you know, has probably had a very fresh experience of why this is important, but I'm just going to run through a little bit of context setting before we discuss it as a panel. So for those who don't know, it's not looking good, climate. And I sort of put a quote there, we can't talk about adaptation without highlighting the need for mitigation. And I want to recognise the work that Sam did within his own party, helping us to get bipartisan support for the emissions reduction targets, and how important that is, that we get to be a leader in emission reductions. We've still got a little way to go till we meet 1.5, but I think that's a damn sight closer than I thought we would ever get a little while ago. And as a young person, that's a really important thing. So thank you for your leadership in the party. But it's looking really scary for Northern Australia. And we had I recently attended a briefing from the Bureau, and it wasn't looking good. We're going to see increasing events similar to what we had over summer. But just before the cyclone Jasper and the preceding floods, we also were in 7 back-to-back heat waves. And before that, we were putting out fires all over the Tablelands and Cape York. And, you know, apart from the environmental impacts, there are some really severe human impacts that are coming along with that. So to talk a little bit about heat waves, I know this is a pretty sad slide, but it's a sad time. The Queensland government data says that we're likely to see a substantial increase in temperatures, and we're going to see hotter and hotter days, and an increasing warm spells. So in my adult life, every year has been the hottest year on record, and that's set to continue. We've seen as these heat waves continue and our temperatures overall increase, we're seeing species like Lemuroid possums and other really heat-sensitive species moving up and up into higher areas to be in temperatures that they can manage. We're also seeing, though, mass death events. And I think we can all remember 2018 when we saw 23,000 flying foxes fall from the sky. But as an environment centre, CAFNEC is often on the front line of community calls about smaller events, and we hand them over to the Department of Environment and Science. But, you know, Bronwyn and I have had the pleasure of going, you know, to the Mulgrave, to Saltwater Creek, to all of these different places around our area where when there's heat waves, there's low dissolved oxygen. We're seeing big fish deaths in our waterways. And you know, in the context of all of that, we still have the highest mammal extinction rate in the world in Queensland. And the leading cause and the leading threat to, you know, those species is climate change. These are some pictures from the recent floods that we've had. That's the Barron River Bridge at the airport. And that's some of the coastline north of Port Douglas. And you can see that orange in the water are the sedimentation plumes from the water, and you can see the landslides along that coastline. Our region has been rearranged by the last floods, and I'm sure that Zoe can talk more about some of the impacts, you know, that we're seeing up north. But basically, I remember Jonathan Knott said, as someone, you know, a hydrologist or a geologist, it's very exciting to be alive when an event of this magnitude happens, because they only happen about every 2,000 years, but they are happening more frequently and they're set to happen more frequently. And so we need to be aware of that. But also the community is really feeling the impacts of climate change. the insurance that we are facing due to climate risk is ever increasing, and Cairns, let alone Far North Queensland, is known for having some of the highest insurance rates, and we also have some of the highest percentage of uninsured people in the in the country. And if you just look at the little blue men who are all standing like this, they're the number of deaths between 1900 and 2011 by disaster. There hasn't been upgraded comparisons that I could find, but obviously it would be getting worse. But one of the really interesting things is that extreme heat kills more people than all of our other climate hazards combined. It's an invisible thing that a lot of people don't see. It's our vulnerable communities, our elderly, our young, our First Nation communities, our remote communities, and it's a really big issue and something that needs to be addressed, particularly in Northern Australia. So I could talk about climate change for a really long time, but it's really important that we give everyone the chance to speak today. Climate adaptation looks like a couple of different things and a lot more than what I've put in this slide. One of the things that we're really concerned about for the environment after the floods is short-term funding for the cleanup and the work to recover environmentally as well as communities from the catastrophic floods we've just had. When we talk about long-term funding for the flood recovery, just figuring out where our invasive species have gone as a result of these floods is going to be a major task. The reality was there isn't good baselines for water quality in Cape York and the Gulf already. We don't have enough funding for science and for rangers to be getting out there and creating really good baselines for water quality. So we need to see not only responses, but improvements to what we're doing to create those baselines and make sure that there's ongoing monitoring. We need to see the protection of the climate refugia and threatened species habitat that are providing really important refuges for those animals that are going rapidly extinct. And, you know, I wouldn't be me if I didn't say we do still have some of the highest land clearing rates in the world. And unless we change that, we won't be addressing, you know, the need for what we need for climate adaptation, but also for reducing climate change. When it comes to protecting people, QCOS 2100 which is the program that funds local governments to do coastal hazard planning, doesn't currently allow those councils to include riverine flood modelling. At the time when that program was introduced, we didn't have the science to really do that work between coastal hazards and riverine flood modelling. We do now, and JCU's leading that. So we really want to see QCOS 2100 helping local governments to integrate riverine flood modelling so that we can prepare for what events like similar to just what happened here. But also it doesn't have the latest data on sea level rise. It doesn't talk about how we do nature-based solutions. We have one of the leading councils in that work, and we still are struggling to do that as best we can because QCOS 2100 is competitively funded. So in our dream, we'd love to see that councils are just funded to do hazard planning and supported to do that. But we generally want to see increased risk reduction and risk management and really prioritising a safety net for our most vulnerable communities.
Well, there's a four-day conference just done in 5 minutes, so well done. Questions, please. There's a lot in everything that Lucy and the panel have got here. You've got some questions around. Deborah, thanks for starting off.
Okay. That second item there, protection of climate refugia and threatened species habitat. The top of the dividing range in Queensland is a very important stretch of landscape in that regard. But at the moment, the current government is plastering it with more than 50 industrial wind facilities that are going to fragment that habitat, cause erosion problems, loss to threatened species, et cetera. Do you have any thoughts on what your government would do about developments on the top of the dividing range?
The framework for wind projects is nowhere near adequate. That's a massive understatement. And I should thank Lucy. A couple of years ago, I think you raised Planning Code 23 with me, and I was just blown away when I looked at it and how basic it is for the type of projects that it's approving. That urgently needs to be updated. I think the work's been done internally, so I'm not sure what the delay is with implementing that. But we can't have these projects progress at the expense of nature. There will be environmental impacts, but to see that they have a process that other projects wouldn't have to go through is not right. It should be a more even playing field. We've repeatedly called for that. I think I did a speech in Parliament directly about Planning Code 23 because I've seen communities across Queensland where these things are being put in inappropriate locations. So there are places that they can go. We've got a lot of land in Queensland, and there is already land that has had impacts on it. But to see it go on to some untouched habitat is really disappointing, and it's a failure of government. So that absolutely needs to be updated as quickly as possible. There's some broader ideas around the environmental management of these projects. One that I'm particularly interested in is making renewable energy an environmentally relevant activity, like you have for other major projects, mining and agriculture, for example. Then you could govern them through environmental authorities. I think that's got some merit, but it's completely inadequate at the moment, and that's without even touching on solar farms, which are governed under local government rules. Lucy might have some more comments on this.
Yeah, I think sounds like a rapid release of the State Code 23 is something that you'd be keen on, just like us. I think the only thing I would add to that is that, you know, there's a lot of work that the state has done and will need to continue doing post-October, advocating to the federal government for the reform of the federal environment laws, which, you know, are categorically failing, and, you know, a lot of these projects will go there for assessment. But I think what we're seeing the government currently fail to do is effectively do land use planning to plan where these projects, you know, should go. And we keep hearing about how the renewable energy zones are going to coordinate development. Well, that ship sailed. We're in uncoordinated development, and we need to start having some interventions like the review of the State Code 23, regulating what's happening now. And also, if you haven't, you know, I know that Sam's engaged with the community, the Dyer review of community engagement in the energy sector, but we need to see the industry really stepping up when it comes to community engagement. You know, there isn't a requirement for community engagement under State Code 23, but that doesn't mean that the industry shouldn't, you know, couldn't be doing it better on their own, and their industry relies on it. So I think we need to be both looking at industry, but the government, yeah, some are, but not enough of them. Yeah.
Thanks, Lucy. Up the back first. Oh, right at the back. Who is that man? Then we'll come down to Mike. We'll come to you next.
Thanks, Lucy. Alan Dale, JCU. Hey, Lucy, I'm keen to just explore a bit about where you feel the regional planning standards are with the EPBC and what you understand about where they're going, where they are, where they might go. But then to throw across maybe to Zoe about the potential linkage and the real opportunity to get it right from the NRM sector point of view. So thank you.
Yeah, so I might.
And that wasn't seated either.
Pass to Zoe as well. No, it wasn't. So I think everyone should be really concerned about the bioregional planning and whether it's going to happen now that we see the federal government slowing down on the EPBC reforms, and why that's relevant. So most of us have interacted with regional plans, which are different to bioregional plans, which the federal government has created memorandums of understanding with the Queensland government to create, to coordinate, you know, how we're understanding biodiversity in regions and what should be conserved. That was going to be the primary tool that would inform where where not large scale development should be happening. So without bioregional planning, we don't have the planning that says where these developments could go. Now, could we just use the regional plans we have in place and reform them? Probably. A lot of that mapping does already exist. But from the very beginning of bioregional planning, and I'll hand over to Zoe after this, is I remember when I was younger, I read our regional plan and I was like, this is going to be a good life. That is a nice plan. I feel good about my future. And then it didn't happen, you know? And that is because the regional plans they create outcomes, but those outcomes aren't measured. There's no one who's accountable for them, and they're not publicly reported on. Now, I think there's some really good people in the planning department right now who are changing that. And I want to thank all the leaders in this room who have been with me in those regional plan reviews, fighting the good fight. But we really need to see public accountability to regional plans, whether they're bioregional or regional plans under the state planning, because until there's accountability, there's no one to answer to the poor outcomes we're seeing on the ground. And that's the case for every sector, not just environment, that we're not getting the balance for anyone really at the moment. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think I'd second Lucy's comments there about the complexity of the relationship between bioregional planning and the regional planning system, which then, from my perspective, we would overlay the regional NRM planning process over the top of. So a lot of plans, and plans are great, but plans do require implementation in order to be effective. And I think in a lot of cases, that's where things fall down. So I think from my perspective, I would like to see some simplification of the planning system and some implementation.
Thanks, sorry, Mike, and then we're going to wrap this one up. But again, people can catch up with people afterwards. Mike, you had a question?
Yeah, Mike Merrick. Mike's on.
It's the people online, Mike can't hear you. Thanks, mate.
Mike Berwick. My question is a planning one too, and it's about one particular aspect of planning, which is the ongoing development in hazard zones. Hazard zones either because of sea level rise or storm surge or riverine flooding, and I still see councils doing it as if it didn't exist. Those places are going to go underwater one way or another. The people are going to get hurt, properties are going to get damaged, they won't be able to get insured. There's still developments approved and people can go ahead and build in those zones despite all that known science. I heard an academic saying that and it's pretty obvious, I think, that the obvious thing to do is you've got to start relocating communities, because that's going to be a lot cheaper than keep propping them up with disaster relief. So transferable development rights, is that something that the government, your government, would be interested in looking at to get any further development out of hazard zones and into safer places, let alone the relocation of ones that are already there?
Okay, Mike, and then we'll get Sue to wrap up as part of that too.
Haven't considered it. Can't sort of make a position on the run, but I'd be keen to get some more information. Bree and I had an excellent meeting this afternoon with who was that, Bree, on the... Great question. That they couldn't make it, but it was after Bree came to that excellent forum that was held here on your recent disaster. She wanted me to be across that, and that was a point that was put. Wasson, that's right, with 2 S's. That's right, good. I knew it was it had a funny quirk in the name like that, but yes, it was a point that was made very strongly to me, and certainly something that needs to be considered, and I might pass it.
Yeah, planning's been the focus of this discussion, and I, from my point of view as a resilience specialist, all these planning initiatives need to come together to be effective. It's no good having a bunch of, really separate plans that don't talk to each other and operate in silos. So the Queensland Reconstruction Authority is looking at some of these other land management approaches and different ways of funding these issues. We've also got, and I have to say this is a huge improvement on earlier ones that I was involved in, a really good state disaster resilience strategy, which does make exactly the points that you've raised, and recognises the importance of tying in climate adaptation and so on as well. From a wider community perspective, and a resilience viewpoint, I think it's also really important for individuals to better understand the effects of what will happen where they live. It's not well recognised, and I know from working with communities here in recent months in a voluntary capacity that people just did not understand what a metre of water through their house meant. They could say that, but they had no idea what that looked like in practice. And this is something that we need to really work on better improving, so that when people are making an individual choice, if they are buying in a hazard zone, they know what that means. And it's not just words on a piece of paper. But yeah, there's a lot more work to be done on this. And yeah, the planning work involved and around hazard management in future is going to, in my view, need to be much more specific and much more on target.
Right. So thank you, Deborah, Alan and Mike for the questions, and thank you, panel. I'll bring up the last panel now. So Stuart, with your panel, Lucy and Duncan. And
Chris, just
Sam.
on that topic, before we wrap up, can I just say that the NRM region's Nurturing Nature, Cultivating Culture has an excellent disaster adaptation and climate resilience package at $31.8 million. You want for that, Chris?
Beautiful, Sam. This is just seamless. Well done, Sam.
Is that what that's in that package? Yes.
There's no point saying it, Sam, until you actually get the money, though.
Okay, no, fair enough.
All right, thank you, Stuart. You've got your team out here. So Stuart's going to talk about, and the panel, nature markets, with a focus on lifting up the nature-based economy in our region, growing nature markets, and the lack of investment in nature. 2 minutes.
Minutes. Got 4. Okay, thank you very much. My name is Stuart Christie. I'm the CEO for Train NRM, and I would also like to thank Gavin and Dennis for their welcome to country earlier on, and to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So the purpose of my presentation is just to kind of give you a little bit of highlight, which kind of builds on some of the conversations we've had before today, is around how we value nature, how we increase investment in nature, and how we actually encourage effectively potentially an incoming LNP government to spend more money on the environment, and to introduce kind of the role of new kind of financial instruments on how we can actually kind of try and attract more investment from the private sector into nature and the environment. So I wanted to kind of take a moment before we kind of dive in, just to remember exactly how special this place is in the world that we get to kind of live in. It's, we shouldn't take it for granted, because this is basically where we get to kind of live. Nowhere else gets to live in a place where we've got 2 World Heritage Sites side by side. Okay, Lucy. The World Economic Forum has estimated that 50% of our global GDP is highly dependent on nature. But in our region, I think it's even more valuable and more important. Our tourism sector, where Mark kind of represents, is kind of highly reliant on our reef and rainforest. Our construction sector is driven by people moving here because of the lifestyle and the environment that people prize about this region. Our higher education sector and ag sectors are obviously completely reliant on our healthy ecosystems. The other thing about these things is that as an asset, it's very rare that you actually get something for free. We've got these massive assets that we've got them for free. These generate and drive the economy. They generate billions of dollars in revenue. They employ thousands of people. However, we invest very little to maintain them. Okay. So despite the fact that they're under threat from a changing climate, inappropriate development, and the spread of pests and weeds. Okay. So I had a conversation with Bree a couple of months ago, and we were talking about, well, actually, if we ended up valuing these things as hard pieces of infrastructure, what would it kind of look like? So if the reef was valued about 56 billion about 7 years ago, it's now, if you put a bit of inflation on that, it's about 68 billion in today's terms. So if we were going to end up doing that and think about it as a dam, we'd be investing over $1 billion a year in maintaining that asset. If it's the wet tropics rainforest, similar situation, we'd be spending about $100 million a year on maintaining that asset. If it was an infrastructure asset, we wouldn't bat an eyelid. on it effectively on these costs and the investment that would be provided into them. Okay. So, however, the Australian government has budgeted to spend about 500 million this year. The Queensland government about 80 million in total, effectively on investment in our assets. The Biodiversity Council has estimated that we need to be spending at least about $4 to $5 billion a year nationally on actually kind of conserving, preserving, and actually increasing the health of these natural assets. So we spend about 10% of what's actually needed to contain these assets. And if we want to keep actually these assets in the health and resilience to keep supporting the economy and the jobs, we need to invest more. Okay. So internationally, there's growing awareness and momentum for governments and business to recognise how reliant we are on nature and to invest more. The carbon market is a good example of where the private sector has started to invest. It's not necessarily ideal, but it's now a sector that's worth somewhere about $948 billion annually globally. Okay. And the climate and biodiversity crisis is really driving some innovation in the finance sector. We've been working very closely with Cairns Regional Council, WECMA and others, effectively about looking at how there's new sort of multiple finance instruments that are being developed to increase investment in the environment sector from the private investment sector. However, government need to continue to be a major investor, and this challenge cannot be outsourced to the private sector at this point. Okay, so Terrain has been involved in developing a reef credits, and a new biodiversity credit called cassowary credits, because of the lack of investment that's kind of coming into the region and to try and meet some of the shortfalls in investment. And all these initiatives, which we're really understanding, take time to develop and are not overnight solutions. So my request to a potential incoming LNP government is that what we need to do is to reassess how it values and invests in the environment, because it's not a nice to have, it's actually critically important for the future of this region as it supports jobs and the economy. It's significant. We need it to kind of significantly increase the investment in the environment, and we need to be kind of proactively working with the private sector to establish and de-risk effectively a range of different financial instruments to increase investment in the environment. So that's it. Yeah. And so I'd like to just kind of introduce my kind of panel. So I've got Brian Singleton here, who's from the kind of the Cairns Airport. We've seen Brent, who's the environment manager at the Cairns Airport and a director of Terrain. I've got Duncan Patterson here, who's from the investor group on climate change, who's an advisor to Terrain, and obviously somebody you haven't met before is Sam O'Connor. So it's me. Stuart, thank you. Thanks, Stuart.
Okay, who's going to answer off a few questions for nature markets? Big opportunity, private investment. How do we achieve private investment at the scale we want? So I'm going to ask that. I'll ask that. Duncan, how do we get the private sector involved?
So the Investor Group on Climate Change is the peak body for climate-focused investors in Australia, based in Sydney, offices in Melbourne. We do a survey each year of the size of the market in Australia called State of Net Zero Report. The most recent report's just come out. We surveyed 68 financial institutions across the country, a total of $35 trillion assets under management for those institutions around the world globally. 35 trillion managed by investors who are headquartered in Australia, and that's on behalf of over 13 million Australians through their superannuation and through the investments that are managed on behalf of those superannuation funds. The vast majority of those investors have got policies on climate, and the really interesting thing that has happened over the last 5 to 10 years is that the topic of climate and climate risk has gone from being a marketing spin, a box you had to tick, a nice to have, to being generally recognised as being a critical part of any investor's fiduciary duty. If you are planning for the retirement of people in 10, 20 years' time, you have to be taking into account climate. I start off by talking about climate. Obviously, that's the area I work in. But what's been interesting to observe over the last 4 or 5 years is the rapidity with which the topic of biodiversity and nature has caught up with the topic of climate. The advantage that the financial markets around biodiversity and nature have is that they've been able to observe the last 10 years of mistakes that have been made in the climate markets and learn from those and learn not to make those mistakes, replicate the models that have worked and replicate the processes that are actually leading to real world outcomes. And so they're going to have a really big head start in terms of being able to advance their practice and be at the same level as climate is today in terms of implementing biodiversity and nature-based thinking in terms of investments. We're talking very, very large pools of capital that are anxious to seek out this type of investment. The federal government recently, with its Green Bonds initiative, had that heavily oversubscribed, which means there are far more investors who want to buy those bonds than there were bonds on sale. There is enormous demand, both locally and around the world, for opportunities to invest dollars in a way which contributes to not just climate change mitigation, but also to reducing the risks and problems associated with biodiversity and nature loss. I would like to say how good it is to see a government and an opposition taking a bipartisan approach to the topic of climate targets. We've seen a very unhealthy couple of weeks, and it's kept my team extremely busy in Sydney, I can tell you, in the last couple of weeks, having to deal with a lack of bipartisanship on this incredibly important topic. And it's been a little disappointing to see. So it's really good to see an example of it being handled well in this jurisdiction. So that's a bit of an idea about the size of the market.
Surely there's a lot of questions there. 35 trillion sounds pretty exciting to me. Question in the back.
Hi, Sophie Barrett. I just had a question. A lot of businesses and councils are having targets for 2030 for net zero emissions. I just wanted to know what your thoughts were on some of the ideas around encouraging Australian offsets or offsets for rehabilitation and those other things.
Who wants to take that one? Offsets.
Just, I'll take it very quickly. I think the idea of offsets for nature is a terrible idea. Certainly the federal government has sort of shied away from it after initially indicating that they were interested in the idea. I gather it's still slightly up for debate. I hope not. There's an obvious and fundamental difference between carbon markets and natural markets in that nature is a local thing, and whereas a carbon market is essentially fungible, carbon here and carbon there is reducing what's in the atmosphere. It just doesn't work that way with nature. So the concept of having offsets for specific projects, I think, is open to all sorts of risk, to put it mildly. I don't know if there's other ideas on that one.
Just wants to touch that. Stuart, you gonna have a go?
I
think you've got an answer.
Just to add on that one, it's a great question. Just to add on that one, my team is responsible for the local administration of two of the world's largest climate target setting initiatives, the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative and the Paris Aligned Asset Owners Initiative. And both of those have very strong requirements in there that you don't use offsets to offset portfolio emissions for the investors, just because it's quite risky in terms of due diligence and supply chain and all that kind of stuff. So.
Thanks for that one, Sophie. We've had a lot of kind of discussions about kind of offsets, I suppose, within the NRM sector, recognising that offsets, they need to be the last thing that you can end up doing. So avoid, reduce, mitigate, offset, and that's the last thing that you can end up doing. And currently, I suppose, that within the Queensland government, there's a whole heap of money that's sitting in an offset fund that can't actually be utilised because effectively there's not the quality of projects and offsets that are out there that can then fulfill the obligation. So we're having kind of discussions kind of internally about how do you actually then turn that around, recognising that development's going to have to happen at some point. But what we want to do is to end up making sure that it's the best quality outcome that you can possibly kind of get what we don't believe is just, as Duncan says, you can't just kind of wipe out a set of, high quality biodiversity in one area and then just recreate it over here as part of an offset. It doesn't happen. It's a bit like kind of going, okay, well, we're going to demolish cairns today, and then we're going to build another city up on the tablelands, but everybody's going to die, as we're kind of pushing over the buildings. And then, we're just going to build some buildings, and then somehow miraculously this new city is going to appear up on the kind of tablelands. It's just, so it's just about the kind of, how do you actually kind of do that from a practical perspective? So yeah, no easy answers, but not something that people want to kind of dive into.
I was just going to say, I don't really understand the offset side of it, but when people say that to clear land, they're going to clear land, they pay, they get a permit, they pay money, and it goes into an account. I just, I mean, today, I'm not here to represent the airport. I'm here as a Yirrakanji man, as a land manager. And I think it's, where government needs to really be transparent. I think you need, if you're going to pay money, I know on small scale projects, we've seen a lot of clearing, we've seen a lot of development, but we're not seeing, what we take from nature, we're not giving back. And I think there are opportunities to see those offsets going back, or the funding going back to help some of these projects in some of these vulnerable areas, rather than, it's like we don't see what's happening. It's been really transparent. I wouldn't know what an offset project is. Where is it? Any project gone back to revegetate or plant trees? Most of the, I think, yeah, it might not be viable, but I think that there's a challenge there to try and, especially in a World Heritage area like ours, we should be trying to do something there.
Great response, Brian. Thanks, Sophie. It's a hell of a great question. Sorry, I had Sarah first, and then, okay, Mike. Then we'll go to you, Sarah.
My question's about getting private sector investment into the high biodiversity areas. So we've seen the carbon market has worked well out west, where you've got big land ownings and the numbers stack up for people to earn money out of carbon, because it's quite high transaction costs. But it's not happening on the coast, which is where most of the biodiversity is, because the landowners are small, the projects don't stack up economically. And I would suspect that the solution to that is to be able to aggregate a lot of small projects into big ones, but we have no mechanism to do that. If the state could help do that, or Duncan or Stuart or anyone got any ideas how we might do that, that would be transformative to getting private sector investment into high biodiversity areas.
Statement or a question, anyone want to have a go at that or not? Massive challenge. There's been a fair bit of work behind the scenes on it, Mike.
And I think, there's a lot of, and this is, what I kind of alluded to before, which, and you've been actively involved with the whole kind of credits through Green Collar, but none of these things happen overnight. And once you've kind of got a solution to one thing, there's a problem to something else that needs to be solved. So that aggregation model is something that we've got to end up addressing in kind of wet tropics. And Sarah and the team have been sort of talking to some organizations who are looking at, innovative kind of models and how we end up doing that. But I think, that ability to work closely with the state government to kind of end up going, okay, well, what are the things that are the barriers that can be helped to be unlocked by kind of government? And then what are the things that others are better placed to kind of unlock? And just now, I think the Land Restoration Fund has been a fantastic initiative by the state government, but effectively it's kind of got to a certain level and it's like, okay, well, there's a whole heap of other wave of opportunities coming through. How do we actually then take that initiative to the next level? And that's, I think, the opportunity to kind of end up working, more closely with organizations like yourselves, with us, government, organizations like Duncan. And I'd probably also want to maybe just throw a bit of a question to kind of Lucy, sir, slightly separately, but the airport have done a lot of innovative work around some of the sustainability kind of linked loans and things around how they were the first airport in Australia to do, or the first project anywhere in Australia to do some of that sort of stuff. So there's some innovation that we're using in different places, and it would be really interesting, probably kind of a little get thoughts from Lucy just on how you did that and what lessons learned you've probably had from that. So I'm sneaking in the question, sorry.
You're the boss.
I think you answered a question and then asked a new one, but that's okay. With the offsets, and in our experience, it's been, it's already so cheap compared to doing a land-based offset to just pay a financial offset. That is, that's the way that it is. It's much more expensive to go and buy land and, do that land-based offset. So when we're looking at a lot of those coastal areas and the high value areas, they are more expensive and usually not available. So I think until it costs a lot more to pay a financial offset, it won't stack up to do those projects in those areas that probably do need them. On the financing nature, so the airport does have a sustainability linked loan. That's an agreement with all of the major banks where if we perform well in that sustainability space, then we do get a discount on our interest rate. And that money in theory goes back into that program to run that biodiversity program. So our specific example is, so each of the agreements are very individual with the banks or the funders and the businesses, but we have been able to secure one. We're just finishing our second year now, and Brian is a big part of that program. But basically ours is around biodiversity. So we're looking at protecting biodiversity on airport land. And if we protect those threatened species, then we do get a discount on that interest rate, which ends up being a fairly significant amount of money that goes back into that program. I think every good business is not going to wait for government to tell them what to do. We've got a social license to operate. And we are making money off these land areas as well. So I think, working with government's really important, but business also has that responsibility, and there are mechanisms to fund projects like this outside of, that regulatory framework.
Thanks, Lucy. Thanks, Stuart, for bringing that to our attention. That's fantastic. We've only got about a minute to go, according to my clock here. Sarah, do you want to have your last?
Sure. Sarah Hoyle, just a quick question. Well, it's not quick. Governments have a role in terms of providing further investment into nature, but they also have a role in policy setting that would support greater investment by the private sector. What do you see as some of the key things that your government could do to improve that?
I think it crosses over into the federal space a fair bit from that level, but the role that I articulated before for the state is how we can align this with our conservation framework, and then how we could use these markets and mechanisms as added value for landholders or corporations or whoever may be the person who has that property. I think that's the defining issue, and if we don't figure that out, we're not going to protect enough of Queensland. And I was at COP last year. I saw just the enormous scale of global capital that falls under the climate-related financial disclosures and that system that was set up, I think, at Glasgow originally. I think biodiversity is the next thing, and that is where we have an enormous opportunity in Queensland. We're the most biodiverse state in the nation. This is one of the most biodiverse regions in the world. If we can find a way to funnel that global capital into this region, into management, into protection, aligning that with sustainable economic development and all the things that we love doing in this region, it's a really, really, really important thing, opportunity for this part of the world. And I'm not exactly sure the defined roles between the state and the federal, but that's the priority for me is the conservation of state and how it fits in there.
I couldn't resist adding briefly, absolutely agree that a lot of the boundaries and burdens are set by state regulation through ASIC, and Your Future Super is a particularly tricky one at the moment because it makes it very difficult for trustees to move outside benchmark returns, and therefore investing in nature, which is not traditional benchmark, starts to make their portfolio returns bounce around and look difficult to regulators. State governments do have a really strong opportunity, though, to actually put their money into this process. State governments are issuers of fixed income and capital. They sit on very large pools of capital. They usually have state-owned investment enterprises. Queensland government is blessed with several, depending on how you count them. And if nature-based thinking and the utilisation of finance and natural capital markets was built into more of the decision-making that was taken at the Treasury level, I think there'd be opportunities for Queensland to really take the bull by the horns.
If I can just add further, that's already happened in the renewable energy space. Overwhelmingly, the investment in renewable energy in Queensland is through our government-owned corporations, which, again, that's another bipartisan thing. There's no desire from either major party, despite some of the rhetoric you might hear sometimes, to sell those corporations. And I think if you could apply that through the significant financial vehicles that we have as a state government towards biodiversity, and thankfully as well, we have the Shadow Treasurer in town tomorrow. So I think this might be something we should raise with him at lunch.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks everyone for that. And thanks to this panel, and particularly Sam. I guess he's sat through all three panels. So thanks, guys. So we will wrap up. I've got a few reflections from listening to the fantastic input from everyone tonight. So for me, it started off with Gavin and Dennis's beautiful welcome and the talk of power of partnerships. I thought it was a really compelling story the guy started off with. Then we had a bit about classification of forests. So I thought that was interesting discussion in Rose's panel around the protection of areas and how you define those, and actually getting potentially some perverse outcomes from some of that approach. Mark, I love the 7-to-1 tourists. Eyes and ears out there. 7-to-1. Mark's gone now because he's busy looking after his family. But yeah, I thought that was an interesting bit of resources out there that perhaps we don't value enough, the tourism, in terms of being eyes and ears for us. Lucy, around the heat waves, some pretty scary stuff there that we've seen. But we've got to stay positive because we're smart humans, so we'll find solutions to these problems. But the impact on humans and ecosystems, is, as we know, is quite extreme for the projections. The mini regional plans. So thanks, Sue, for the reinforcement that we've got to integrate and implement these plans, and no silos. I don't know how many times we hear that, so we've got to work out a way of breaking down silos. I did then get super excited by Duncan talking about $35 trillion of investment funds. Like, how can you not get excited by that? We just want a little bit of that, Duncan, 1% of it. Yep. But yeah, Stuart's whole challenge about more investment from the private sector. And how do we make it easy for the private sector to invest in the programs that we know work? And so there's a whole lot of opportunities around new biodiversity markets and government to help us. And the last conversation around offsets and generating nature positive outcomes. And great examples, Lucy and Brian, of the work that you guys are doing around some of that stuff at the Cairns Airport. So thank you everyone for participating, particularly the 16 that are now down to 13 online. That's a great bit of resilience by staying on. So thank you for everybody that contributed online, and thank you for everyone that contributed here. And I think, as Sam alluded to and others, they're hanging around for a little bit if you still want to catch up with them around any questions. So thanks for your participation tonight. Oh, I should say, Stuart has made a similar invitation to Minister Linnard too. So Minister Linnard has been given an equal opportunity to participate and in a panel such as this. So thanks, Stuart, for that.
Thanks for coming, and thanks for all you do.